Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel session on what needs to happen to improve outcomes from school education. Just a quick reminder that this session is being recorded. My name is Patrick McFall, and I'm part of the communications team at Audit Scotland. Today's event comes off the back of a report looking at how effectively the Scottish Government, councils and their partners were improving outcomes for young people through school education. Audit work started back in 2019, but was paused when the pandemic struck. When it restarted, it took into account the impact of COVID-19 on school education. It was a joint report by the Auditor General and Accounts Commission and took us up to early January this year. Much, of course, has happened since then. Today, we're joined by Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General for Scotland, and Sharon O'Connor, a member of the Accounts Commission. We're also very pleased to be joined by Carrie Lindsay, Executive Director of Education and Children's Services at Fife Council and President of the Association of Directors of Education. The format today will see Stephen and Sharon talk briefly about some of the key findings from their perspective from the report, and then we'll have a response from Carrie before getting into the Q&A. I'm just going to briefly share my screen now for a little bit of housekeeping. So if you could, as you can see there in the slide, hopefully, it'd be great if you could use the chat function to ask questions, and we'll do our absolute best to get through as many as possible in the time that we've got. Stephen, I'll step out of the way now and let you just get us going with some of your thoughts about the report from your perspective as Auditor General.
Many thanks, Patrick. Good afternoon, everybody. Really delighted that so many colleagues in education have chosen to join our session this afternoon. And before I say a brief contribution on the detail of the report from my perspective, just wanted to record my thanks to the Scottish Learning Festival for having us as part of their agenda this afternoon, and really looking forward to the conversation with Carrie and Sharon as we go through the discussion. Our report from March 2021, as you mentioned, Patrick, was somewhat interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic as we had planned for publication in the spring of 2020. We took a bit of time following the pandemic and used that time to update the report for capturing some of the impact that the pandemic had had on school education, and set that in the report. As it relates to improving outcomes for young people through school education, we reported that one of the two main planks of Scottish education, in closing the poverty-related attainment gap and increasing better outcomes for all children and young people in Scotland, is universally shared. So there's a consensus that that is the right measure, and that everybody is working hard to do so. We also recognise that it takes time to close the poverty-related attainment gap, and by no means will the work of colleagues in education be the sole contributors to what is a very complex set of circumstances. But we found that the pace of progress hadn't been as quick or as consistent as the Scottish Government had set out in what it referred to as its stretch aims. And I guess that was one of the main findings from our report. In our work, we also looked at those broader aims of curriculum for excellence. And we particularly noted that it was more difficult to determine what was happening in areas around the well-being and confidence of Scotland's children and young people. And that based on the fact that we know and we hear educationalists repeatedly refer to the fact that school is about more than exams. And that we know also that there is plenty of data and data gathering that happens within schools, but that isn't always reflected in a clear picture of how school education is performing and what needs to change to improve outcomes across the Scottish education system. Thank you, Patrick. In its overall sense, we looked, I suppose, the infrastructure and the range of stakeholders that exist across the education system in Scotland, and note the contribution of the Scottish Government, Scotland's councils and other partners, and that as a general rule people were working well and a shared commitment to improving outcomes, and that affords a strong platform and foundation to make some of the changes that inevitably will be happening. And lastly, we also note that our work predates the recent publications of the OECD into education in Scotland, particularly around curriculum for excellence, and what now happens in the senior phase education system. We would observe that there are some synergies between the conclusions that we've drawn from our work and those from the OECD, particularly that point that I mentioned about the incomplete data picture around all the planks of curriculum for excellence. As ever, it's important that whenever there's a context of structural change that happens in public service reform, is that the structure and the focus on the structure doesn't squeeze out the overall objective of producing better outcomes for Scotland's children and young people. Patrick, I'm happy to leave it there by way of introductory remarks and hand over to you and Sharon to lead us into the next part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Stephen. My name's Sharon O'Connor. I'm a member of the Accounts Commission, have been for the last 3 years. Up until December of last year, I was chair of the Education Authority in Northern Ireland. So I'd like to start my remarks by acknowledging how difficult a time educationalists have come through. COVID presented a whole set of challenges that none of us were prepared for, but I think one of the things the report highlights and does so, I think, very effectively is how much effective collaborative working there was by everyone in education at all levels. And that work that had been done in terms of collaborative working with government from a policy point of view and through local government is evident in much of the success in terms of the response to COVID. And I think everyone who's been involved through this very difficult period is be commended for that. So the whole challenge is so very complex that no report is going to provide clarity on the answer. There is not a single answer as far as I can see. I've just been reading a new book by John Cotter, the leadership theorist, and he talks about the complexity of managing these very large tasks. And one of the things he suggests is that it really has to be about ground level, and it really has to be about local leadership. And I think there's a very significant relevance in that for the challenges that the report flags up. We know that poverty is at the heart of attainment challenges. We know that these problems are much bigger than an individual school or an individual council leader. It's really about a joined up effort, and the report points to building on that sort of collaborative working that has been successful. I think the report also draws out the very important role beyond exams and the education process into the health and well-being of our young people, and it does point to the very significant role that school leaders and all of the education workforce have played in supporting young people through this time. The challenges in terms of the variation of performance right across the country is more difficult to explain, and I think that's an area that will bear considerable research in the future. There is not necessarily a direct correlation between finance resource and educational attainment, although poverty is obviously a very, very significant factor. So the report hopes to illuminate some ways in which these challenges can be met. Clearly, those challenges are now going to be examined across the country in Scotland. There's much to be done in bringing things together, but I think overall we need to have a joined up effort insofar as we need collaborative working, we need policies that are integrated, we need local leadership to be a key feature in that response. And I think too, we can't forget parents and young people, children and young people in this scenario, because expectations about what success looks like is different depending on where you stand. philosophically or from a point of view of your professional outlook on these matters, but definitely we need to respond in proactive ways. We need to have plans that can really get to the heart of how we can impact on some of these really ingrained poverty-related attainment challenges. I think the report commends the very significant innovation that there's been throughout the education sector in responding to the very particular challenges presented by COVID, and how much innovation there has potential in terms of future development and improvement. So from our point of view, it was a fascinating experience to be part of. We are not here to present a table of answers. There are lots of people looking at these challenges, and happy to be a part of it. And thank you again to the festival for the invitation to be here today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sharon. Carrie, you've heard what Stephen and Sharon have got to say. How would you respond to those comments then?
I suppose definitely would welcome that the report recognises the hard work of staff across the education sector, and I think that it has been a very difficult and challenging time, so that's very much welcome, and also that it recognises that strong foundation that we can plan and work together towards better outcomes for our children and young people, and I think that's crucially important about how we take things forward. I'd want to say at this point that I don't agree with everything that's in the report, and Stephen and I've had that conversation already, in particular using a small number of indicators to draw conclusions about variation, for example. But I'd like to maybe just make a few points in relation to some of the themes in the report to build on what's been said already by Stephen and Sharon. I think in terms of poverty, that we need to better understand the complexity of poverty and the place that education plays to improve the outcomes for those children that are living in poverty. The joined up policy approach from the Scottish Government on child poverty is really crucially important for that, because education can't do that alone. Obviously, the inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID, and I think the importance of the SAC and PEF going forward are key areas that we need to look at together. I also think that the data is an important thing, and I think the outcome indicators that are used in Audit Scotland are readily available indicators, but do they tell the whole picture? Do they tell everything that we need to know? And do they measure the right things? And I think the report itself does talk about the fact that perhaps not having measures on the 4 capacities, not having some of the NIF measures that perhaps look at confidence and the way that children can actually operate in society rather than just in exams. So we need to ensure that the use of that data supports improvement in the system and measures the right things. It talks a lot about variation, and Sharon touched on that there, and it's something that we've been thinking about for a long time. We know that there's more variation across a school than there is across a local authority, so variation is something that definitely is in our minds. And I think that we've had the promotion of the empowerment agenda in Scotland, and I think that whilst national policy provides a framework to support consistency alongside local and professional autonomy, when you have that empowerment in there as part of your national policy, it won't always lead to consistency. And I think that indeed what we need to make a decision about, is that what we want? Is we want compliance and consistency, or do we want to improve the outcomes for our children and young people and have a system that effectively supports that going forward? There are a range of reasons for variation: geography, connectedness, ability to attract staffing, resources, structures that are in place. So it is quite a complex picture to actually be able to see what the reasons for that are. And maybe just to finish on my opening remarks, just to say that I do think this is about a collective endeavour, which is why I'm pleased to see that strong foundation being referred to. Nobody can do this on their own. Children and young people can't do it, parents can't do it, education can't do it. It's about all parts of the system, children's services system, working together, as well as working locally, regionally and national with our national organisations and the Scottish Government. So it is a big task for us to make sure that we take the areas that we feel we really can learn from within the report, and collectively try to understand something about that variation in performance, and make sure that we are committing to a collaborative improvement model that allows us to really continue to make improvement for our children and young people going forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. That's great. I wonder, Sharon or Stephen, if either of you wanted to come in just briefly before, and I would encourage everyone on the chat, please put your questions into the chat and we'll get through as many of them as possible. But in the meantime, Stephen, do you want to go first and perhaps followed by Sharon?
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I wonder if I can pick up a couple of points that Carrie makes, and I think the first thing I say, grateful for the feedback actually, and there's really an audit report that we produced that has met with universal approval or acceptance of our findings and recommendations. But that colleagues in education, I suppose, recognise the kind of general thrust of it, and that that it's a balanced report. That we're recognising that there is a strong foundation in education to deliver upon the challenges that are still facing, and as you rightly say, have been exacerbated by COVID. I suppose there's kind of two things I wanted to mention is what happens next, particularly about some of the poverty-related attainment gap. Now that we know, and I've heard from the Scottish Government, its intention to invest a further £1 billion on the Pupil Equity Fund, and what that means, what will be the drivers for success around that. And Audit Scotland has been reflecting over the past year or so and has made comment about the Christie report, the 10-year anniversary of Christie, and the drive for improvement, and some of the kind of factors of why all of the objectives of Christie hadn't been realised. Yes, undoubtedly due to austerity, some of the incentives perhaps, but also that kind of additional conclusion that we draw about people, not just in education, but really all walks of public services, will perform to the measures that are most prominent. And one of the findings that we sought to tease out in the report was to challenge about the dominance with which the use of and the measurement of education tends to be skewed towards exam performance, and the need, if education wishes to have that kind of wider conversation about how to measure education, the importance therefore of stronger measures and stronger indicators, recognising all that you say, Carrie, about that there is data there and how we've interpreted that, but as a general principle, if those measures are stronger, that moves the conversation on about how school and education performance can be measured. So it feels like a real opportunity into the next decade as to what Scottish education will be looking like and how educationalists will shape its future. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Stephen. And Sharon, did you want to add to anything to that, or come in something differently?
Well, just very briefly, certainly the points that Carrie made very effectively are around the complexity of the challenges, and part of that is the challenge. How do you manage change when you're actually trying to intervene in so many different ways? So I mean, really I'd pose the question back to the sample company. How do we do the effective collaboration? How do we ensure that we mobilize educational leaders to be part of a change process that really is going to have impact on those many and very complex inhibitors in terms of improvement? I don't have the answer to that. I don't think anyone has, but I do think it's got something to do with how we style programs of change and how we work together to achieve those goals. So thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Sharon. And Carrie, a couple of questions coming through, but do you want to respond at all to Sharon there? I know you don't know the answers, but do you want to reflect on that in any way?
I think probably to answer the question in the chat might answer a bit of that. I think that it's absolutely right that it's very complex, and if it was easy, people would have sorted this a long time ago, because it's not that people don't want to change the outcomes, particularly for our youngsters who live in more disadvantaged areas. I think, Anthony's question there about eradicating variation that will never do it, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that there are quite a large number of protected characteristics that come into play here, not just about poverty, but thinking about additional support needs, care experienced young people, children on free school meals. And that when you start to multiply up the protected characteristics, that's when you see that there's a real disadvantage for those young people who have more than one protected characteristic. So I think that we need to look beyond just the poverty-related attainment gap and look at what are the barriers to learning for the children and young people that are in front of us in our schools and our classrooms every day. And I think that that's where we need to shift the dialogue and the discussion to be given every child a chance. And the Curriculum for Excellence actually gives us an opportunity to do that. And I think that's where it links into what the OECD are saying about Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland is a good sound. It's a bit like our good sound foundation. It is a good curricular foundation for us to be able to build on and actually meet the needs of individual youngsters. But schools can't do it alone, and I suppose that was in some of my opening remarks, that this is not just about what schools can do. It's about how we work together at a local level. How do we make sure that we learn what works? So we learn from each other about what actually works to help and support young people. But we also learn about how we work together better to eradicate some of those difficulties or barriers that our young people face. And we can't just do that through schools. And I think that sometimes people expect that, you know, it's often been seen that education is your route out of something. Well, sometimes that can be the case, but sometimes that's not always possible. It needs to be working together. And I think that that's what I would like to see going forward. It's much more a holistic approach, as I said, with the Scottish Government policies more joined up together, so that we're all actually trying to work towards the same end, and that children's services in totality, rather than just education, are taking that forward. And I suppose that, you know, just to finish on Anthony's question about, you know, how long will it take to have the attainment gap closed to an acceptable level? Well, what is an acceptable level? I suppose that's one of the things where it's difficult to say whether people have made as much progress as they would want, because in the Audit Scotland report it said about whether you had made or hadn't made progress, but how much is enough? And I think that that's probably a debate that we will be having for some time. What we want to do is to close the gap as much as we can. What is acceptable? I wouldn't be prepared to put an amount on that.
Thanks, Carrie. Really interesting. And everyone, please just do put your questions into the chat. Stephen, I wonder, or indeed Sharon, if you want to respond to any of that in terms of perhaps the idea of compliance versus autonomy as well, and what that means, and the focus there.
I'm happy to kick off, Patrick. Actually, I mean, I understand, I think particularly in the sector, and I think Carrie touched on it, about the empowerment agenda that has happened, and it will be for local education leaders, head teachers, to make the best decisions, you know, for the children and young people before them. And we've seen that through the funding environment, through PEF that has happened, and the range of evaluations that have happened in the use of that money through Education Scotland, Scottish Government in recent times. And I think it goes back to the point from a minute or two ago, is that in making this level of investment that the Scottish Government has signalled its intention to do so, you know, £1 billion over the course of the next parliamentary term, as to how well to measure how money that will be used. And I get that it's complex. Of course, it's complex, and it's, you know, it's not just about educationalists that will contribute to closing the poverty-related attainment gap, but yet this is an investment in education, and therefore there'll want to be some indication, and not in 5 years' time. I think that's the kind of key, is that, and that's I guess the role that we think about in public audit in Scotland. The last place we want to be is coming along many years after significant amounts of public money have been spent, and producing a report that says, oh, well, you really ought to have done this or this differently, and that money has or hasn't been spent well. But where appropriate, with the right amount of independence, is that actually thinking about running alongside some of these significant spending programs, and if necessary, you know, drawing interim conclusions and judgments about how well that money's been spent as it progresses through the system. And, you know, there may be some brave and tough choices that educationalists will want to make as this progresses, about that it's not necessarily, the best outcome might not come from education spending this money. And it may be that it's for other parts of public or third sector services that could have a greater, more tailored impact on the lives of children and young people, and closing that poverty-related attainment gap. And I think it's that kind of level of flexibility that we'll need in our thinking across public services, if we are to see some of the step change in outcomes that we all sign up to. And yet, again, I don't mean to hark on about it, but in terms of Christie, it is that if that flexibility that looks beyond organisational and sector boundaries, it's probably exactly what we now need more than ever coming out of COVID, that we've got that tailored spending options that can make the biggest difference really to people's lives.
Padraig, I just briefly follow up to that. I think that is absolutely on the nose, really, in terms of the challenges, particularly coming out of COVID, where we know there are going to be massive challenges for young people, children, young people, in terms of their health and well-being. And on top of that, we know we're going to face into a very difficult time for families, particularly those who are already in poverty. So the old truism that children who are coming to school hungry are not best placed to learn is certainly very relevant in terms of how you apply spending to attacking that poverty-related gap. And so I do think there needs to be open-minded and creative thinking in play, and I really do think that needs to be informed by the people who are at the heart of the educational experience for children, and those people are the school leaders, the leadership within schools and within local councils who are delivering educational services to the whole range of children within an area. So thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Sharon. Question from Angela Gardner that I hope you can all see in the chat. The report says more evidence is needed to understand educational achievement beyond exams. Do we have any examples, Stephen? I wonder if you maybe want to come in first, and perhaps Carrie, you might have some thoughts on this as well.
I think, yeah, happy to kick off, and I'm sure Carrie probably better placed to challenge or come in with more detail than I am. I think there's a theme that we picked up, Patrick, really through the report, is that the dominance of exam results as being the measure of the success of a school and a local authority education provision, away from the other capacities of curriculum for excellence. And I think that really led us to the conclusion that, and maybe challenging, that a sense of the data didn't bear out the equal application of the four capacities, that and the strength with which you would measure a school's performance or the experience of children and young people. So we and our team looked at how Scottish education was performing relative, using the data available to other parts of the rest of the UK and beyond. And I'm not sure that we come up with a ready-made, off-the-shelf example of here's how to do it. There'll be people better placed than us, probably OECD, but more likely the people on this call today, Carrie and our colleagues in ADES, that they'll know, as the kind of what the appropriate measures would be, and how best to implement it. It's one of these times, Patrick, if you forgive me, is that we can often say as auditors, here's a way of what not to do, and at times we can rein ourselves in rightly to say, look, it's not always for us to make the recommendation of how to better implement a policy and then come along and audit it. So we're kind of mindful that there are some boundaries to our role at times. And this is one of those examples where we'd say is that we've pointed out that there are gaps and there's not that parity between the four pillars. But I think it's really for educationalists now to say, well, if you've all signed up to this, how are you going to measure that?
Thanks, Stephen. And Carrie, have you thoughts on the question posed about, have you any information about other, what's done elsewhere in other countries perhaps, or thoughts just generally?
Yeah, health and well-being has always been an area that's been close to my heart in all my career in education, and we've looked for many ways to measure happiness, to measure confidence, to measure contentment. And it is really challenging. There are some scales that we can use, and certainly we've, in my authority, we've used a number of things over the years to try to measure some of those, but none of them are used consistently across all local authorities. So therefore that does give Audit Scotland, when they're trying to look for some of that evidence, a bit of difficulty. And I suppose that's where we then see a reversion back to using the local government benchmark framework, which is the outcomes that were used by Audit Scotland. So I think that that's where we do have some way to go in terms of agreeing some measure. I think that the health and wellbeing census that the government have pulled together, which is quite a perception data, if I could put it that way, it will start to gather that data around health and well-being of our young people and their mental and emotional well-being too. So I think there will be something there that will help us going forward, but we do need something that's more at a school level and a classroom level so that people can start to interrogate that kind of data along with the kinds of data about the progress that people are making in their academic attainment and the achievement. I know that attainment and achievement are kind of separated out. They're all achievement to me, but I think that that is equally important about how we make sure that we do give more parity of esteem to both vocational and achievements that are perhaps not necessarily seen in the formal sense, you know, so Duke of Edinburgh Awards, a whole range of different things, leadership awards that some of our young people undertake, for example, an Active Schools Leadership Award, that the confidence and the growing that those young people do in terms of volunteering and doing that work, but it doesn't get the same parity of esteem as if they got 5 hires, for example, at level A. And the media has a lot to do with that. So I would say, I know, Stephen, I would maybe challenge you back on the fact that educationalists don't or haven't found ways of being able to measure that, because we find lots of ways, we push those ways of measuring certain things, and then the media always revert back to the, you know, the 5 hires or the whatever measures at the time that they think they can make a story with. So I think we're kind of stuck there, but you're absolutely right, and I agree with what it says in the report on that we do need to find better measures that look at the capacities. If Curriculum for Excellence 4 capacities are absolutely what we're about, if that's the key priority, if that's the key thing that we want our young people to be able to achieve through going through all these years that they do in a school, then let's make sure that we're measuring some of that and not just measuring some of the certified subjects that they do.
Thanks, Carrie. I'd like to move on to a question from Dee Clark that if you could come in again on, and then perhaps be followed by Sharon. So this is about creativity, how creativity contributes to closing the poverty-related attainment gap. Does the system cater to individuals and creativity to do that? What's your opinion, Carrie, of that question? And Sharon, I wonder from your side of things, the great experience you've had as well, what your reflections might be on that question. Is there enough being done to unlock people's creativity and ability to actually close the gap?
It's a great question, because I think that often we're criticised in education for being not very creative and following, you know, pretty rigid rules and frameworks and guidance. And I do think the empowerment agenda gives us the opportunity to start to look to those that are creative, but we need to make sure that we scaffold and support that, and that there is some accountability within it. So I think the Education in Scotland report on closing the poverty-related attainment gap, their progress report, did highlight a whole range of creative case studies, ideas that were actually having an impact. So we do see that across our schools in Scotland, and I haven't been in a school for some time because we're trying not to have extra people in our schools, and I've seen things online, and I follow very much on social media what my schools are doing, as well as what the head teachers are telling me. But when I was in the schools, I would see huge amounts of creativity, that people were being encouraged and empowered to do things differently, and they were having an impact. But people need a bit of a framework to feel safe to do that. And I think that sometimes if you're being measured on your exams, so say for inspection purposes and for Audit Scotland purposes, if the exam measures are the things that are being used to measure your success, then you're less likely to focus on the creative aspects that might not get you the 5 A's or however many qualifications you're looking for, or to close the attainment gap. So I think there is something in what we measure that drives people to be less creative if it's not a creative measure. And I understand that is hard, because we do need to be accountable, which is what Audit Scotland is about in terms of holding the government to account. And that is absolutely right too. But I do think there is an opportunity for us to be more creative and to support each other and to try out different things, and especially to share that when we see it being successful, so that if we are trying completely different things and we're seeing a real success, then let's make sure we shout about that so that everybody knows about it.
Thanks, Kat. Yep, Sharon.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, there's the creativity that I have to say I am absolutely convinced that I saw evidence of it, you know, in the material that came through this report, in terms of the creativity of school leaders rather responding to very challenging circumstances and doing things in very different ways that were effective and productive. There's the context in which we encourage creativity in our children and young people to be able to take account of the opportunities that are afforded them. I do strongly believe that we need to educate our whole society about what success looks like and not be wedded to what success was like for us in our generation. It's got to be about a different set of measures. And I think there's opportunity to be found in a post-COVID environment. Employers are finding it very difficult to recruit in many sectors at the moment. So the whole area of, you know, going for baseline qualifications, they're beginning to be very flexible about how they recruit and the sort of skills they're looking for. So I think we have to modernize how we prepare children and young people to be part of a very different future from the one that all these systems were established in. So I think there's opportunity, and there's great evidence that school leaders are up for that challenge in terms of being innovative and creative.
Thanks, Sharon. Stephen, I wondered if you might want to come in on what Carrie was saying there about, you know, the drivers that can stymie creativity. That's something that we've seen as an organisation beyond education and, you know, as a public sector thing.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me to comment on that. And we get that. We actually get it quite a lot. This, you know, that we better not be innovative or take risks, you know, for fear of being criticised by, you know, whether it's ourselves or internal auditors or another regulator or inspection body. And we can't dismiss that. Patrick, was the thing where we've got to, is that we recognise that, you know, we have a role to play. I think and our role is dual. That it is about providing assurance on how well public money is being spent, and we do that through our public reporting. For people on the call, Audit Scotland has no powers of intervention, so, you know, we can't stop public bodies doing anything. But how we discharge our function is reporting to the Accounts Commission and reporting to the Scottish Parliament, and we report publicly. And we also have a role in terms of supporting improvement, so being that vehicle that comments and highlights where things are happening really well in public services. And there are some great examples of, you know, in education and beyond, of how well public money has been spent, where appropriate risks are being taken, and where innovation is happening. And there's an important role for us to further shout about that within public services. I was going to actually just to connect that, if I may, Patrick, just to the point that Carrie made about this level of innovation, particularly in Dee Clark's question about, you know, the examples and needing to put some scaffolding around that. So I think, you know, education departments have a role to do that. I think, you know, Audit Scotland and Education Scotland and others similarly have a role, because yes, if we're in favour of autonomy, that can be hard though. It can feel quite isolating, I'm sure, for, you know, for head teachers and others to be given a budget, go away and spend that budget, and, you know, whether it's PEF or others, and in a way that may or may not lead to the outcome. So I think in those circumstances, what we often see is that can lead to kind of risk-averse approach and making quite safe choices of how to spend that money without necessarily knowing that it can lead to really quite innovative and significantly groundbreaking changes. And the last thing I'd say about your point is that we need to be careful about that, how we respond to that. And it's a point I've been making really throughout COVID, the vast sums of additional money that have come to Scotland. So, you know, I think we're over 10, 12 billion pounds of new monies that have come to Scotland. Not all of that will have been spent well over the course of the pandemic, but the pace with which money has had to be spent was the key driver. You know, whether it's an education setting about getting devices out to children and young people to support their home learning, or in support to businesses, or acquisition of PPE and so on, is that inevitably, just with the paces, some of that will have dipped below what would have been acceptable pre-COVID. But for us, we need to kind of be careful in some of our judgments about that there's empathy and there's context behind some of that spending.
Thanks, Stephen. Carrie, you were nodding a bit there. Did you want to come back in?
I was nodding as well because I was just reading Dee Clark's next comment. Sorry, don't know your first. Oh, Douglas, it's Douglas, about the Venn diagram there and about the sweet spot between accountability and creativity. And there's maybe more things that would be on that Venn diagram because it is quite complex. But you're right, it's about trying to, I suppose, encourage people to understand their place and their role in things, and some of that is about being accountable, some of that is about following a framework or a guidance, but within that you have hopefully the authorization to be empowered and to be creative and innovative. And I think that sometimes, certainly I see that sometimes, that people feel that they're restricted by the measures rather than by the policies or the guidance that they have. And I suppose that the report says that to a certain extent, and I think that that's absolutely right, and that's one of the things that we do need to think about going forward, that can we have different measures that don't restrict us in that way, so that there's still an accountability within that empowered system, which is what we're trying to create. And I'm not so sure it's about autonomy, because I think that's something quite different. It's about empowerment, but within an accountable system, where all of the time we're thinking about improvement. So you never get to that point where everything's great, do you? So it is that kind of self-improving system that is empowered to make the improvements that are right at that point for that class or that school, but with an accountability built in. And maybe there is something about that accountability being, I suppose, defined by the people in the locality rather than being defined externally, or maybe there's a balance of both, which would allow us, I think, to bring in one of the other comments there about, I think it was Michelle, that about self-confidence, that a teacher or a practitioner can measure that on a daily basis. How do you use that information then to actually show how you build that up to be part of a school or a local authority, and when you're looking across the whole of Scotland? So maybe we need to start to think differently about not just what we measure, but how we measure it and how we report it at a local level.
Sharon or Stephen, do you have any thoughts there?
I'll defer to Stephen on that one.
I'll try and be brief, Patrick. I'm sure Sharon will want to as well. To me, it feels like a really pivotal moment for education. So as we've seen for the last two cycles, that teacher-led assessments are forming the basis of exam results, and when maybe that's, I think as you're suggesting, Carrie, that there's a potential application there for the education system to reach those teacher-led judgments on the other facets of curriculum for excellence. So yes, with the right accountability, with the right assurance model around that can be tested, and it might also do that thing of moving the conversation beyond into that place that school's about more than exams, and that we've got metrics and ways of measuring that in a different environment that we're in and have been for the last years and decades, that says that the schools aren't just now about exams, and we've got stronger ways of measuring it too.
I think that's so true, Stephen. I think it really is about, there's a real danger that we park all the tremendous innovation that occurred because we all responded to this crisis, and that we don't actually take the learning out of it and rethink some of the things that have been holding particularly school leaders back. I'm a huge fan of local leadership, and I really do think now is the moment not to snap back to where we were. Take the opportunity, bank the learning, bank the innovation, and try and remodel things that get us to a better place.
Thanks, Sharon, and that's probably a good point to end at with 1 minute to go. Thank you for everyone that's been on this call. Maybe just a thought as we finish up. Earlier on, Gail Gorman, Chief Executive of Education Scotland, remarked that a number of reports have come out this year, including Audit Scotland's, the OECD and others, and in total there's 39 recommendations for the sector. So a lot to think about. And as we started off, I think it was Sharon that said, there's no simple answers, but that was a great conversation. Thanks again to the panelists. Thanks to everyone who joined, and especially thanks to the Scottish Learning Festival and everyone who posed a question today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thank you.